I'll start off saying what I've already said several times today and will say again several more times today, which is that I can't say how grateful I am to AXA for providing me with this opportunity. So far, my time at Bristol has been fabulous, and I was reminded when Brian said that he spent his first 18 years in Bristol. I actually spent my first 18 years in Rhode Island, which also has a Bristol, and I've realized why now. There are very close connections between Bristol, UK, and my area of origin in the US. But it's been a fabulous group to work with, both the School of Earth Sciences and getting to know people in the Cabot Institute. And I wanted to say wholeheartedly thank you to all the speakers this afternoon, because in my mind, this is exactly what I wanted when I heard that there was a Cabot Institute. It's exactly what I wanted, the sort of community that I hope to interact with while I was here. And I hope all of you are as excited about the diversity of talks we heard this afternoon as I am. So I realize it's late, and it's probably a little late and a long day for a scientific talk, but I did want to tell you a little bit about my science. Let's see. So I'm going to do a few things here. First of all, I want to introduce you to me and why I'm interested in the topic of volcanoes in society and a little bit of how I got here. I wanted to delve a bit into a continuation of the sorts of things that Caroline talked about, on talking a little about the historical perspective, particularly on distal impacts of explosive eruptions. It seems to be something that people in the UK have discovered recently, but in many parts of the world, people have been living with this for millennia. Then a bit of science and the science that I'm interested in, which is how this ash is formed. So I'll give you a little perspective on that. And then initially, when I made this slide, I said summary and reflections on the day. However, as the talks were going on this afternoon, I was reminded of, oh, okay, I can make that connection here and that connection here. So I've been tossing slides into my talk, which may give it a little bit of a mishmash sort of feel, but hopefully, as a whole, will integrate what we've heard. So we've been talking about volcanoes and society, and I see this as intersections in various directions. And in terms of my interests, first and foremost, I am just plain old an academic volcanologist, and I'm not going to try to pretend otherwise. However, as you'll see, my initial introduction to volcanoes actually involved quite a bit of media work and policy work. So I went into the field with that as a foundation rather than getting into it later. And I also have had a long-term interest in the science-humanities link. I actually tried not to be a scientist. I tried to be an English major. And that one of my pet sort of side projects has been thinking about oral traditions about volcanoes. And I was tempted to give my whole talk on that because that's sort of my fun hat, but I will just show a few slides. So first of all, a little bit of background on me, and I'm embarrassing myself by putting in funny pictures, but my first active volcano was an unusual one. It was Mount Erebus, which is a volcano in Antarctica. And I had the chance to go down there first in 1978. For those of you in the room who remember, this is Haroun Tassieff, who was a famous French volcanologist. A few other faces here that people will remember, including Werner Gegenbach, gas geochemist. And when we were there, the goal was to get Werner down not only into the main crater, but into the inner crater of Erebus because he wanted to sample gases. So several of us were down in the main crater. Werner went down in the inner crater. However, Erebus erupts usually a few times a day, and there was an eruption, and we had bombs falling around us, and Werner got a burn hole in his pants, and everything was fine. But a media release went out from Scott Base, Antarctica. The media release was very matter of fact. luckily, I was able to call home from base before my parents saw it. But that media release then sort of propagated around the world, and we started collecting versions of it. And the best was from somewhere in Australia, where they had descriptions of us being surrounded, flooded by molten lava, and they actually had quotations from us. So at that point, I realized, okay, there's a translation problem here. And everyone always thinks of, I don't know, Dante or hell or something when they hear about volcanoes. So that was lesson number one. Ironically, then my next experience with volcanoes was not only at Mount St. Helens in 1980, but I was brought out there to be the public information scientist, which meant that I did all of the media interactions in addition to working with the Rotary Club and the Lions Club and school kids and the Fruit Growers Association and the Truckers Association who were worried about ash and engines and you name it. I didn't have any experience in media communication. I had to learn on the fly. But it did, first and foremost, this experience propelled me back to graduate school. I decided I didn't want to do that for a living, but it did give me a really profound appreciation of the challenges of communicating science, and particularly this whole topic that we've been talking about with uncertainty, and the fact that we have uncertainties, we deal with them as probabilities, but the probabilities are actually quite difficult to communicate and translate to people. So since that time, as I said, I've mostly been in academic institutions, though I have worked extensively at volcano observatories, many, many years of working in Hawaii, where, again, if you're working at an observatory, you can't not engage with the public and with any sort of media event going on. I also had the opportunity to work with Willie, among other people. Here's Willie hiding in the back as part of the Scientific Advisory Committee at Montserrat, which I found to be a very humbling experience because, again, when you're confronted with having to supply information, you realize how big the uncertainties are that we are often dealing with. So what I do in a single slide, or what I'm known for doing, is that I look carefully at the rocks produced by volcanoes, and in particular, I look at the bubbles. These are holes that are left in pumice, or the crystals. This is an electron microscope picture. These rectangular things are crystals. And use those to interpret or look at the impact of bubble and crystal formation on eruptive processes. This requires calibration with laboratory experiments, and one of the excitement that I have about being in Bristol is that I can further my long-term collaboration with John Blundy's group and Alison Rust's group on different types of experiments that are necessary for interpreting the volcanic rocks. The motivation for me being here, and I think for AXA funding me, was this little event in Iceland that you all know and love well in 2010, which of course the Eyjafjallajökull volcano produced a series of eruptions that sent ash over in this direction. And I don't need to list the impacts. I borrowed this one from this slide from Shona Mackie, but it affected airlines, it affected airports, it affected people. In fact, a friend of mine had a daughter who was doing a high school year abroad in Spain, and she and a friend had decided to go to Ireland for a week, and they ended up there for 3 weeks, much to her parents' distress. She was fine. There were lots of issues of compensation, and as we heard earlier, lots of issues of supply chains being disrupted for, what did Willie call it? The JIT, just in time. And in fact, the news got over to Oregon. This was drawn by a young friend of mine, and she entitled this picture Flying to Europe in spring 2010. And so you can see that this actually had a global impact and definitely reached beyond Europe. But I wanted to spend a little time showing you that these distal impacts really aren't new. The specifics of them are different now, but there's a long history of ash and distal ash affecting populations. Wanted to mention, this is some work that Dave Pyle was involved with. He mentioned the Chai-10 eruption, and this shows ash plumes from 2 different days, well, May 3rd to 5th, May 6th. You can see, first off, they're profoundly affected by wind direction. But one thing they found was that even very small amounts of ash, a few millimeters, was enough to affect agriculture and livestock. So it doesn't take much. And one of the things that I find amazing about this map is that they're measuring the ash thickness to very, very minute quantities. Well, of course, they had to get out there and do that right away because small amounts of ash don't hang around. And so one important thing that we're learning is for current eruptions, it's critical to get out there right away and get data because otherwise it's lost, and we don't have that for past eruptions. I put this slide in at the last minute when Susanna was talking about using media and using images, and I wanted to point out that even before the internet, we could do this. This is a picture of the Mount St. Helens eruption, probably about 30 minutes into the eruption. It's a composite photo that was put together by a guy who was visiting his brother, apparently stepped out on his brother's deck, saw this scene, he'd never used a camera before. He picked up his brother's camera, shot a perfect mosaic, and the slides that I copied it from was dirty, but somewhere up there was actually a United airline flight that could be identified and allowed scientists to be very specific about the time that this composite photo was taken. And in fact, one of the amazing things about Mount St. Helens in 1980 is that there were many, many people around, and there were many, many sets of photographs that were critical for reconstructing what happened. So that was to emphasize Susanna's point of the importance of media. The Mount St. Helens did put out a pretty good ash plume, and because in the Northwest, winds blow from west to east, the ash plume traveled across the state of Washington, over Idaho, and down into Montana. It was very well tracked. Again, we didn't have the sort of satellite coverage that we have now, but we did have satellites. And so we have a pretty good sense of how the ash plume moved across the state of Washington. One of the big impacts was that although people near the volcano certainly knew the volcano was becoming restless and there'd been a lot of media attention, the people far from the volcano hadn't paid much attention and were shocked that in Yakima, Washington, the streetlights came on at noon. In Ephrata, Washington, this was the view over the airport as the big ash cloud came over. And in Moscow, Idaho, which is more than 500 kilometers from the volcano, people had to deal with the consequences of the ash. And what everyone learned in a hurry is that ash is not like snow. It doesn't melt. And so you actually have to physically do something with it. Yakima was pretty creative. They put all the ash in the landfill, smoothed it off, put grass on it, and it's now soccer fields. It did have a big impact on people. Gary Snyder is a poet from the Northwest who grew up near Mount St. Helens. He told me that he couldn't even go back to the area for almost 20 years because he was so shocked at the transformation of the landscape. But finally, someone was asking me about Fred Swanson. Fred Swanson convinced Gary to go back. And in 2004, he published a book of poetry called Danger on Peaks. And in the poem Letting Go, he said, roiling earth gut, trash cloud, tephra 12 miles high, Ash falls like snow on wheat fields and orchards to the east. 500 Hiroshima bombs in Yakima, darkness at noon. Darkness at noon is a common theme, and I was struck by this piece that Caroline found and sent my way. It's about an eruption in Mexico in 1793, and the description says the sun was so much darkened that in a radius of more than 15 leagues, it was necessary to use at noon artificial lights. The birds were so stunned with such an unexpected darkness that they halted where they were, and in some places, partridges could be caught by hand. In the neighborhoods, people assure me that they had never experienced such a gloomy night as on that noon. So again, this conflict, this darkness at noon. We can go even farther back. Mount St. Helens had been active in the 19th century, and there was a particularly large eruption around 1800 AD. This story was collected in 1920 by an anthropologist who was working actually in Canada, so northeast of Mount St. Helens, up the Columbia River. And he collected the story from someone who said it was told to him by his grandmother. And it says, when my grandmother was a little girl, a heavy rain of white ashes fell. The people called it snow. The ashes fell several inches deep all along the Columbia and far on both sides. Everyone was so badly scared that the whole summer was spent in praying. The people even danced, something they never did except in winter. They didn't gather any food but what they had to have to live on that winter. Many people starved. Well, it's clear why this story was passed on. There's a lesson here. And that is when weird stuff falls out of the sky, you don't give up your normal activities of preparing the winter harvest. And in this respect, a somewhat different example is a book by Russell Blong that profoundly has influenced me, and I was thrilled to see Russell in the room. But he was working on a volcano called Long Island that sits north of Papua New Guinea, and started, I guess, talking to or finding out of stories that had been collected by an anthropologist working in the Highlands about an event that people called Bingi. Is that how you say it, Russell? Bingi. And the Bingi event was described as involving thunder, lightning, and tremors. The sky darkens when it should be morning. Again, this contrast of night to day. For the next 3 days, white silt falls from the sky, covers the sweet potatoes, chokes the streams, destroyed unprotected crops. Afterwards, trees lose their foliage, birds and animals die, and for a short time, there's food shortage. But if you replant the crops, the soil's enriched. And there were very specific protocols then developed for when this event happens. Things like make sure you build protection, lay in food and water, gather the pigs and dogs, cover the garden, all of which are short-term responses to this event for survival. So in this case, clearly the people had experience with more than one of these eruptions, and unlike the event, the 1800 event of Mount St. Helens, where people didn't have the right response, here the response, the proper response, is ritualized. And this brings me to another point, which is that these distal impacts are particularly both disturbing and hard to get a mental handle on because you can't see the source. You know, this is a few hundred kilometers from the Mount St. Helens volcano. And even in 1980, people were caught off guard with dealing with this ash, despite the fact that they could watch TV news. And it doesn't take much to imagine what it would be like if you didn't have news telling you what this strange black cloud was. And from that, this is another of my random, quickly inserted slides. But I was thinking of Katsu's talk about the tsunami from the Tohoku earthquake. And there's a symmetry or a connectivity between Japan and the Pacific Northwest. And we know that the last subduction zone earthquake in the Pacific Northwest occurred at 9 p.m. on January 26th in 1700 AD. And we don't know that because we have written records in Oregon. Instead, there were oral traditions, native oral traditions, that talked about earthquake coming at night, earthquake coming in the winter, earthquake causing tsunamis or flooding, inundation. And the geologists had gone back as high resolution as they could, but then Kenji Satake, who's a Japanese tsunami expert, was looking at various records of tsunamis in Japan and found what he called an orphan tsunami, which is a record of a tsunami that did not have an associated local earthquake. And by looking around the Pacific Rim, he was able to pretty well say that this must have been the last Cascadia subductions on earthquake, because we know tsunami travel times. He could figure out exactly when the earthquake was, and sure enough, it happened in the winter and at night, as the native oral tradition said. However, the flip side is that having seen what happened in Tohoku, my first thought was, we are not ready in the Pacific Northwest for one of those events. We have a lot of work to do. So to the science part of the talk, this is really a big question, and you've seen some posters on this, is what is all this distal ash? Where does it come from? How does it form? And more importantly, can we develop any sort of predictive understanding of what the ash content will be of different eruption plumes? There are a lot of people in this room who are looking at ash and plume transport. There's been a lot of work on ash deposition, but these plume models require that they know what they call the source parameter, and that is what's the initial input of material into the plume. And that's really my interest, and the target of my work is to try to, at some fundamental level, relate the contents of the plume to the processes that generate those plumes. So it's a challenge. I'm working not alone, but with several other people. But the concept is that we're trying to relate the characteristics of the entire deposit to the properties of individual particles within the deposit and relate those back to what's going on under the volcano. So I wanted to walk you through some simple examples of that, of how we think we're getting at this, and give you a sense of, for those of you who are not volcanologists, maybe also a little bit about how we think of how volcanoes work. So the basic concept, and what you see in every simple textbook, is we have some magma chamber down here, which is in itself a metaphor, Guillaume. So scientists use metaphors a lot for themselves, and we talked about this morning. As magma ascends, then the volatiles dissolved within the magma come out as bubbles. That causes expansion of the magma, which accelerates it toward the surface. And at some point, it's going so fast that it breaks or fragments into small particles, and that's what goes up into the plume. So one very fundamental question then is, how does this process of vesiculation, or bubble nucleation and growth, affect the process by which the material falls apart? So first we have to understand how we form bubbles, and just very simply, we know that, for example, the amount of water that you can dissolve in a liquid silicate melt will increase with pressure. The same, of course, is true in a lot of liquids that we might be sampling tonight. And one little example of technology improving our existence is, you probably have noticed that when you have a bottle of champagne, the bottle is thicker glass than, say, a bottle of wine. That's because champagne's bottled under pressure. That's what keeps the carbon dioxide in it, so then it can foam when you pour it. And actually, transporting champagne as a commercial product required developing the technology to make strong enough glass bottles that you wouldn't have the champagne shatter. So there are good analogies for a lot of these processes. Something then that I think about is that if you're going to form bubbles, you can either make lots of little bubbles in a hurry, or you can make a few bubbles and have them grow. And the balance between making lots of little bubbles versus making a few and having them grow is controlled by the conditions under which you bring the magma to the surface. So those are some basics. And again, with simple analogs, we can understand something about how bubbles drive explosive eruptions. And okay, how many in the room have done the Mentos and Diet Coke experiments? Yes. For those of you who haven't, it's well worth it. I don't know who first figured out that if you drop these, sugar-coated mint candies into Diet Coke, you get a good explosion. But it works wonderfully well, and we use it a lot in teaching with students. But what goes on, either in this bubble or in the magma, is that if you decrease the pressure by bringing magma up, then again you get bubble nucleation and growth. That increases the volume, decreases the density, accelerates material to the surface. And if the bubbles grow fast enough, then the fluid is accelerated to the extent that it breaks into fragments, either fragments or droplets. And you can see this in the Diet Coke eruption here, that it's been accelerated and you're actually forming droplets just because of the liquid acceleration. And that's actually, obviously the Mentos as the nucleation device is not a good analog, but that acceleration and liquid instability is probably a fairly good analog for what's going on in basaltic material, basaltic fire fountains. We have a lot of evidence that it's breaking apart as a liquid. We see these bombs that look very fluid-like and deformed as the material was flying through the air. During this particular event, which was in 1984, I had volunteered to work in Hawaii because the volcano was erupting every 3 weeks, so I volunteered for a month and figured I'd get an eruption then, and I did. And being a flunky, I was given the task of going out. So I was actually most of the time in the downwind direction. And what I was supposed to do is every hour go out into the plume and collect material because Bill Rose wanted to know how the gases on the outside were evolving. So as I was watching this material come down, you could actually see the bombs stretching and spinning and pulling like taffy. So it was still fluid and deformable. It was very light and fluffy. I had a hard hat. That was okay. So that's one style of fragmentation. It's quite different in an eruption like Mount St. Helens. And one difference that you can tell is just the color of the plume. And in fact, Mercalli, who was an Italian geologist who gave us the Mercalli intensity scale for earthquakes, he also gave us nomenclature for types of eruptions. His initial nomenclature was there were red eruptions and there were gray eruptions, and then there were mixed eruptions. And that sounds very simple, but it actually points to very profound differences in the whole process. So in the case of something like Mount St. Helens, the material comes out, and most of the fragments are very angular, whether they're big pumice clasts or whether they're very small glass shards. They're breaking brittly instead of breaking fluidly. So we have two very different modes of fragmentation from the same process of bubble formation, expansion, acceleration, and disintegration. And another concept that has been around since the 50s and which Steve formalized very nicely in a seminal paper in 1978 is that in this brittle state, what seems to be happening is the bubbles grow until they interact with each other. They can't expand anymore, and so they break apart. And that means that much of the material is formed from these bubble interstices, which you could see in the previous slide. So that's a good conceptual model. We have sort of qualitative data to suggest that. And I wanted to quick run through and say, well, can we verify that? Because if that model is correct, or if these models are correct, then the characteristics of the deposits and the characteristics of the particles should support this conceptual model. So first of all, characteristics of the entire deposit. A very basic piece of information is what is the total grain size distribution from an eruption. And years ago, I had a student who was thinking about this, and we had some ideas of how it should relate to bubbles and permeability, and we said, well, we'll just check in the literature and find some total grain size distributions. Well, if you think about it, you can realize that it's actually a very difficult thing to determine, because when you have a big eruption, of course, the ash gets strewn around the world. And having the circumstances where you can actually get a reasonable measurement of what came out of the volcano is unusual. However, Mount St. Helens, yay Mount St. Helens, you'll get tired of Mount St. Helens, but it's my pet volcano. As I said, the ash cloud went to the east, which means it was over land. So an awful lot of volcanoes sit by the ocean and dump a lot of their ash in the ocean, which is good for people like Sam who look at ash cores. But it's a little more convenient if it's on land. Additionally, there was this unusual, this is showing the thickness of the deposit, and there was this unusual thickening to the east that turns out was because a lot of the very fine ash particles aggregated together and all fell out in the same place. And this was serendipity and useful for volcanologists because it's the fine ash that usually gets distributed around the world where you can't reach it. Whereas here, some careful work by a couple of volcanologists at the University of Rhode Island were able to get out there quickly, make these measurements, and actually reconstruct the total grain size distribution. So here's what the data look like. It's been reprocessed by people more recently, but it's the same basic data. And I've wanted to mention, so this is just a histogram, the weight percent of individual size classes. For those of you who aren't volcanologists, I wanted to point out the scale, which is actually a scale borrowed from sedimentologists, where the coarse grain sizes are here and the fine grain sizes are here, so it's a little backwards. And it's a log-based scale, so I've put the actual diameters up at the top here. And you can see at Mount St. Helens, there's a range of material. The material that we often think of as associated with eruptions, the pumice class that you buy to, I don't know, wash jeans with or whatever, was really a fairly small proportion of the erupted material. You can see a peak right in here that turned out was mostly crystals. So a lot of the crystals were separating out. And then the big peak is in the very small grain sizes, so 10 microns or so. This is the material that stays up in the plume that affects human health. And it's primarily either little tiny micro pumice or just plain glass shards from those bubble interstices. So that was sort of a surprise to a lot of people. And in fact, I know people who have claimed that this eruption was actually phreatomagmatic because it had so much fine ash, and that was not necessarily anticipated. Just one quick slide. We decided to test this. This is work I've done recently with Alison Rust, and I wanted to say that a lot of this work was actually prompted by writing the AXA proposal. It made me start rethinking thinking this, and so for the students in the room, when you start writing proposals, you'll realize that though the deadlines aren't fun, the thinking that's generated by proposal writing is often quite stimulating. So we had a simple model that the bubbles were causing fragmentation. And if so, we can say, well, then the bubble size distribution should look like the grain size distribution. St. Helens is the only place where we actually have the data to test this. And I've shown this as a power law plot. But the squares and diamonds are two different versions of the total grain size distribution. The circles are the bubble size distributions of pumice that a student of mine measured quite a while ago. And you can see that there's a remarkable correspondence, which actually fits this simple model nicely, which is always nice. If we contrast the Mount St. Helens grain size distribution with that from our Kilauea lava fountain, you can see that they're quite different, which we might expect because we know that they behave in very different ways. The Hawaiian fire fountain has lots of coarse material, no fine material. The Mount St. Helens eruption has all fine material. And similarly, the grain size distribution in the Hawaiian fire fountain bears no relationship to the bubble size distribution. The bubbles are very small, the grains are big. And that means that in these two scenarios, we can see two very different roles of bubbles. In this case, the bubbles are coming out of solution and accelerating the magma out, but it's breaking up because it's falling apart as a liquid. In this case, the bubble size distribution is actually controlling the grain size distribution. And this was intuited by Verhoeven in 1951, that the kinetics of bubble formation might actually control the particles in volcanic eruptions. I wanted to just make a quick mention. I'm not going to go through this, but the idea was that these should relate to something about the magma properties. And just a brief point, so we've noticed that Hawaii behaves really differently than Mount St. Helens. That's probably largely related to the viscosity of the magma, the runniness or fluidity. And I've shown here Mount St. Helens, the melt was basically what we call a rhyolite composition, very, very sticky, very viscous. Basalt down here is very fluid, and I've put sort of for calibration, this is about the viscosity of honey, and this is the viscosity of maple syrup. I usually use maple syrup rather than honey when I can, because I have friends who make it. Note also that the viscosity is temperature dependent. This is something else that you probably all have experience with when your honey has sort of crystallized and gotten too sticky to get out of the jar. You know that you can heat it up and it will become runny again. So that's very similar. And probably the biggest effect of viscosity in this case is it just controls the ease at which the bubbles can expand. Is this generalizable? Well, this was actually the plot that I initially assembled when I was thinking about the AXA proposal. These are total grain size distributions, all the ones that I could find at the literature, in the literature at the time. This is Mount St. Helens, which forms, you can see one end member. And in this case, I've got the grain size in a more, to me, more logical scale. So small is here and large is here. So you can see Mount St. Helens has a very overall small grain size. Here's Kilauea. So it happens that the two examples we have good control over actually bracket the total, or the information that we have to date. Also, it turns out that all of these blues and greens I've labeled as by eruption style. They're Plinian or subplinian eruptions, that is explosive eruptions. But it turns out that they're all rhyolites. So they're all high viscosity material. They're all behaving about the same way. And over here, we've got low viscosity. In here, we have some intermediate ones that I'm not going to talk about. That's actually the research for the next few years, is trying to understand what's going on in this middle range. So I've talked about these two end members. I've presented a nice, neat story, which is always nice to present, but of course the world is messy. And I wanted to just put up a few slides from the Iceland eruption. Work is starting to come out now. I haven't done it myself. But first of all, when it initially happened, it took a while to get some data, but in May, particularly May 4th to 8th, Costanza Bonadonna and a group went out to Iceland and put out samplers so that they could actually catch the ash as it was falling. And this is nice because rather than measuring thicknesses of ash in the field, they can know the mass rate of loading. So this was a month after, or several weeks after the airline closure, but the volcano was still erupting. They could also use those data or collections to make an estimate of the total grain size distribution. In this case, much of the material was at about a size of about 500 microns, so much coarser than the Mount St. Helens ash. However, they realized that some of these were actually ash aggregates, again, just the same things we saw at Mount St. Helens, so that the fine ash was sedimenting out before expected because of that. Additionally, because the eruption was still going on, they realized that there was the material that fell out, but also the material that was still being carried in the plume. So they were able to combine this with satellite measurements, which only provide or access a very narrow size range, so that's important to remember. But they could combine those to get a total grain size distribution. So they disaggregated the aggregates. They added in the satellite measurements. And what they found is that they were actually surprised, again, at the amount of fine ash from what's a relatively small eruption. And I took their data and plotted it on our plot. And you can see it's got a little bit different shape than these big Plinian eruptions, but it's over on the Plinian side, which the first question is, was this just what was going on in May, or was this characteristic of the entire eruption? The answer is I don't know, but Sigge Giselson and others published a paper last year that has some data. They don't say really where their samples are from, but they provide a single grain size distribution for what they call early ash, which was the time period of interest in the UK, and then later ash over here. You can see both are still, they're relatively fine-grained and sort of bracket that May total grain size distribution. So that's interesting, and that raises big questions about what is the fine ash content of these smaller and, in a lot of ways, unremarkable eruptions. And yet, they're eruptions that are happening all the time. So these are the ones that are going to keep bothering us. I'm not going to answer this question, but when I saw the pictures in the Giselson paper, the first thing that jumped out at me, because this is what I do, is that in both of these samples, we can see that there's not, you've got shards, you've got pieces of material, you've got a few little bubbles, but these dark rectangular objects are crystals. And in fact, it's hard to see in this light, but this piece in that early, what's called the phreatomagmatic ash, you can see, first of all, the clast is quite strange looking, and it actually is completely crystalline. So right away, that raises the question to me, is what is the role of crystals? And remember, at Mount St. Helens, we saw that large crystals made a secondary peak in the grain size distribution. So one thing that I'll be working on at Bristol with John and his students and Allison and her students is trying to think harder about what is the role of crystals in forming these ash deposits. I decided I wouldn't go into when and why crystals form because I could talk about that for a very long time and we all want to get to the wine. But anyone who wants to ask me, it's one of my passions. But I'll just end with a few thoughts off the top of my head of how crystals might affect fragmentation. One comes, again, from Mount St. Helens. I told you you'd get tired of Mount St. Helens, but it's done a lot of different things. And in 2004, after quite a long time period of quiet, Mount St. Helens reactivated with a very rapid buildup of earthquakes, some explosions, and then this big thing came out of the ground that was, I called it the sand snake because I read Dune, but it's more formally known as the whaleback. It was a large solidified spine, and in fact, 7 successive of these spines came out. Note that it has a very smooth surface, and the whole outside of this, the outer up to 2 or 3 meters of it, was made up of pulverized rock that we call fault gouge. So in this case, the material, the magma had solidified in the conduit, and in getting out, it pulverized rock. And in fact, we could compare the fault gouge that was left on the spine with the ash that was kicked out during these little explosions that accompanied the eruption, and show that all of the origin of all of the ash was this pulverized rock. So if you have enough crystals in there, it solidifies, and then you have to start breaking it, just as you break a rock during an earthquake fault. Secondly, there's been a lot of work going on, and specifically quite a bit of work in the department at Bristol of the role of adding crystals or adding particles to a liquid and how it changes its rheology or its flow behavior. And there are various models, and it depends on the rate at which you're deforming and the size and shape of the crystals. But in general, even if you have spheres, by the time they get packed to about 60%, you're going to see just orders of magnitude increase in the viscosity or the resistivity to flow or the resistivity to expansion. And many of those intermediate eruptions that I quickly passed over, we've started to look at, including, this is Fuego, 1974. Fuego is one of the volcanoes that Caroline was talking about. She was talking about the 1717 eruption. 1974, there was some wonderfully detailed work and a total grain size distribution developed. And the Fuego material is just packed with crystals. In fact, it's about 70% crystals, the sample that we've looked at. So that has to be affecting how the material breaks. And so that's another way crystals can affect things. Finally, we've been doing some analog experiments in the lab using golden syrup, or back in Oregon it's corn syrup, here it's golden syrup. They're slightly different viscosities. But putting gas through mixtures of syrup and particles, and what we've discovered is that when you add particles, it also affects how the gas is distributed and how the gas gets out. And we think that in some ways, having those crystals in there actually helps the gas get out. So that also helps it to densify, and then it has to break as a solid. So how to move forward? As I said, my goal for the next few years is to work with people here. And ideally, I'm not going to solve this all in 2 years, but I think we can make a lot of progress on relating the processes below the volcano, magma ascent and degassing, to the processes that fragment the material and form ash, with the idea being that we can then work with, say, people in the Met Office, like Frankie here, to develop different types of source parameter models for different types of eruptions, so that when there is an eruption, if we can make a quick assessment of the eruption style, they at least have a starting guide for what the material in the plume might look like.